welcome back to our episode of the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. And I'm very happy today to welcome Olga Israel Dutch. Hello, Olga.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I am so excited about the conversation that we're going to have. And I want to mention that we actually met when we organized the Global Leadership Conference, and that Sharon, if you're listening to us, Sharon, hello. Thank you for the yes, Sharon Altshul, who is the great matchmaker and who really introduced us to each other. So I'm very happy that we're here and that we're going to take time to understand who you are, what you do, and go deeper into all that. But before that, I would like to share with everyone what you do. Who is Olga? So Olga is the vice president at NGO Monitor, which is a research institute that ensures that decision makers and civil society operate in accordance with the principles of accountability, transparency, and universal human rights. Of course, all this is Chinese, and we're going to ask you more questions about that so we understand what you do. But that's at least to put us in the right context. These days, Olga is being invited to speak at the Israeli President Annual Conference, and she also travels the world to speak about UNRWA and other UN agencies, explaining how humanitarian aid to Palestinians need to be conditioned after the war so it doesn't end up in terror like it did on October 7th. And we're going to talk about that, as well as what you do is so relevant to the time that we're in. Olga is also an executive member of the World Zionist Organization, and she is the director of global outreach for Call Israel, and a lot of other things that you'll be able to check in her beautiful bio. But I'm really happy that we're talking, Olga, because what you do, especially at NGO Monitor, is very, very important, I think, in general. But it's also important specifically in the times that we are in now, and we're going to get to that. But before we get to that, I would like to ask a more general question, which is a topic that we address a lot in this podcast, which is, why we decide to do what we do. Why do we become, work in nonprofit or work in corporate? And I know that you graduated from the University of Belgrade and Munich with degrees in banking, in insurance, in finance. I also know that you've held senior positions in the private sector. And so my first question, before we go into exactly what you do, is what made you leave the corporate world of finance and everything else that you did to go and work in a research institute in the nonprofit world? And I'm interested in that answer because, as you know, I'm also starting a nonprofit, and so I would love to hear from your perspective what motivated that transition and that change.
Well, Natalie, that is an excellent question. And before I get into answering it, I really, you just said that you are creating your own non-for-profit organization. I just want to commend you on the incredible conference that you organized. And thank you here publicly for inviting me to be one of the panelists. I was humbled to speak, lined up with these amazing women. And what struck me, and that probably sort of leads us into the answer to your question, is that mixture between women entrepreneurs and women, community leaders and women policy leaders and advocacy leaders. And what struck me was that the mixture didn't feel artificial. It sort of felt very natural, and we had many, many things to share one with another. Experiences or challenges that one felt in one field did not feel out of place in a different field. So I think, that sort of, I think that our journeys, in a way, professional and personal journeys, are exactly that. We might start off at one point, and at that point we might believe that our goal is to get to a certain place. But as we move along, we learn a lot about ourselves and about our interests, but mainly where our heart is. And then the few lucky of us, because I do consider myself lucky, find themselves at the right place in the right time, and probably have a little bit of courage to make that jump from one industry to another, because that's sort of what happened to me. I'm originally from Serbia, a small country in Europe, and I was always involved in the Jewish communal life. And at some point, I was, as you say, I studied business, and I spent most of my days believing that I will work in a bank. And I truly believe that that is what I want, that was my dream. But in parallel to me being active as a lay leader in the Jewish community, at some point I got involved in something that is called the European Union of Jewish Students, which is an umbrella organization of 34 national Jewish student and youth organizations, because it covers the age range between 18 and 30, and gives these 34 national bodies a political representative voice vis-a-vis the European Union, the Council of Europe, the Jewish organized world, and so on. And at some point, I moved to Germany after graduating, and I worked in a consulting company on extremely exciting projects. But at some point, I got elected as the chairwoman of this umbrella organization, and I had to make a decision whether I will continue doing this as a lay leader, or is this something that I would like to try out full time. And I took a leap of faith in myself, and I said, if already, then let's give it a full-blown chance. So I quit my job in Brussels, and I moved in Munich, and I moved to Brussels to do this full time. And I don't think there's another way to say that. I just felt completely at home. I most certainly felt that many of the skills acquired in business school and in working in the field only served me, and made a tremendous difference actually between me and activists who did not come with the organizational, marketing, financial understanding, private sector. And I think that this convergence between, advocating for what we believe in, but doing it in a most professional manner is extremely important when we can get to that. So I did that for 2 years, and then I moved to Israel. I made Aliyah. And then I believe that now my Zionist dream has realized itself, right? So I went back to business. So for the first 7 years in Israel, I went to business development and international sales, but only to realize that my heart was not fully in it. And that's how I ended up joining NGO Monitor, which is where I am now. I've been here for almost 10 years now, because I believe ultimately that we are best at what we do when we do what we love and what we believe in. And that's also when it is that moment when work does not feel like work, even when it's exhausting, and it is. And in our field, we work, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job, but it doesn't feel like work because I truly, genuinely believe in what I do. And I also believe that defending Israel's right to exist as a Jewish homeland is is a work that is not complete by the mere creation of the country, unfortunately, but it is a fact. And this is even more obvious after October the 7th.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Yes. I have to say that I totally love your answer. I think that you're right with everything except, I would say, when you say the few lucky of us. I don't think it's a question of luck. I think that the choices that you made are definitely brave and definitely, show courage. And like you said, a leap of faith. And I could definitely relate to what you're saying when you say that, when you feel like something is missing. I actually also worked in corporate for the first 8 years after my Aliyah. And yeah, something is missing. And then it takes courage to say, let me, make the jump. And I think we're lucky to have people like you making those jumps and helping in the mission and the vision that you have. So yeah, I think it's really brave, and thank you for making that choice.
Thank you. I mean, I can just add one line to that.
Yes.
I made that decision right after having my first son, so that made it that made it, in a way, it was scary because, I just had my baby. So what now? Leave my job, but at the same time, and I think this is something that is unique to us women. The fact that I had a child now made me all the more aware of the fact that I ought to be accountable to my child, meaning, what am I teaching my child? If I'm not doing what I love and what I believe in, then what am I going to teach my child? And that was, my scary age is 65. So I kept repeating to myself, what do I want to see in the mirror when I turn 65 and I look back? And I wanted to be able to say, I did something that I believed in.
Yes.
And yeah, so
Definitely. And I'm so grateful for you to be, transparent and sharing your journey, because, we see people when they reach, a certain level, and then we're like, oh, wow, they got there. And we don't realize that, like you said, there is a whole journey behind it, and there are questions, and it's not always clear, and there are back and forth, and so that's why I like to ask those questions in the podcast, so that women that listen to us, wherever you are on your journey, first of all, it's never done. We're always on the journey. And it's not because you see people at a certain stage and say, oh, wow, she's there, I could never get there. Well, no, we could all get to where we want to go. And that's why it's fascinating to hear your journey. So thank you for sharing. And so I want to go back to NGO Monitor, because that's what you're doing today, and that's why you decided to dedicate your career. And obviously, I mentioned before, what NGO Monitor does, and I said it's Chinese because if you're not from the field, it's difficult to understand. But I think that I told me about the latest news on something that happened in Germany, where you were able to actually do some groundbreaking work. And I think that through this example, we're going to understand why the work that you do is important. So can you share with us what is NGO Monitor and what happened more specifically in Germany more recently?
Well, first of all, kudos on being informed and knowing, following our work. Very much appreciated. So yes, the German government actually, I mean, this is going to sound like a shocker to you, but that's how it is when it comes to Israel and anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, there are no rules. There are rules that apply to everything else around the world, and then there's rules that apply to us. So the German government just announced that they will no longer fund 6 Palestinian huge so-called human rights NGOs that are affiliated to a US and EU designated terror organization whose senior officials in 2019 took part physically in a terror attack that happened on the outskirts of Jerusalem, in which a 17 years old girl, Rina Schnurr, was murdered on spot. We get into the dark topics.
Yeah. So wait. So just so I understand, you're saying that up until now, Germany was financially funding terror organizations. Which one of them was responsible for a terror attack that happened in Jerusalem? Is that what you're saying?
So it's not just Germany, basically, and this is trying to explain what it is that we do. NGO Monitor is a research organization that, in one line, we try to defend Israel's right to exist within what we call the human rights space. Most of these organizations define themselves as human rights or humanitarian NGOs. Now, they vary in their size and type, and they can go from huge ones that everyone knows, like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, that there's not a single person that hasn't heard about them. And they can go all the way to a random bunch of Palestinian NGOs that we have heard about, like the 6 that I just mentioned, and so on. The one common denominator that they all have is that they focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and many of them enjoy actually official governmental funding, taxpayer funding, because a lot of governments in the developed world, including the US government, Canadian government, most Western European governments, they fund NGOs believing that this is how they can build democracy, sustainable development, defend and promote human rights, provide humanitarian aid. This is something that we have been hearing so much about since October the 7th and the war, right? But in practice, what happens is that much of this funding, instead of going to promote all these noble causes, were praiseworthy, right, goals, they go to either terror physically and Hamas building rockets and tunnels by using and abusing physical humanitarian aid, whether it's cement or fuel or pipes or any one of these, or by abusing the non-monetary, so non-financial types of aid, such as, these are provided through services or advocacy type of work. So you would have an NGO that, instead of promoting women's rights in the Palestinian society or access to medical care, right, or equal participation of youth, or any one of the projects, they will spend a lot of that money to incite against Israelis and Israel, to campaign that Israel is an apartheid state at the United Nations, or make submissions to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, or one of these groups, four actually NGOs were sitting in the audience behind South Africa at the court in The Hague a few weeks ago, and one of these NGOs contributed and co-wrote the South African claim. The South African claim had 45 references to Palestinian and other NGOs as viable sources, right? Now, it's basically abusing the human rights space, community, to delegitimize Israel, to try to harm it in any way, from its international legitimacy, to abuse legal structures, to harm it commercially, because a lot of the calls for boycotting Israel or to divest from Israel are done through abusing the so-called international law, or saying that Israel is abusing human rights and so on. So this is where we operate. We research their activities, and then we go to the governments and to the elected officials, and we try to raise awareness and say, you need better checks and balances in place to prevent aid from being abused. And and this obviously gets a whole different dimension after October the 7th.
Of course, I was gonna ask you that. And so you're saying that the work that you do at NGO Monitors is basically bringing more information to those governments that are funding NGOs, thinking that they're doing the right thing, but you're coming with proofs and you're saying, well, this is not exactly what's happening. And you're saying that because of your work, Germany stopped funding 6 NGOs that were basically funding terrorist activities, which is wow.
So yeah, these 6 organizations have been pushing for the apartheid libel against Israel after October the 7th. All of them not only did not condemn October the 7th, but they immediately attacked Israel for genocide and ethnic cleansing. Some of them even completely not only ignored, but one of them actually called the crimes that took place on October the 7th nonsense, and I quote, denied sexual assaults and so on. But these specific 6 that we're talking about in the context of Germany, they're senior officials. What does that mean? Financial director, CEO, and so on. They actually took part physically in the terror attack. One of them was accused by the Israeli security services by detonating the explosive. The other one was in charge of recruiting the entire cell. So they were arrested, and Israel accused them and designated these 6 organizations as terror fronts. But the European governments who funded them at that moment, they said, we haven't found Israeli evidence compelling enough, because they have been working with them for decades. So we campaigned on it for over a year and a half in Germany specifically, and just on Thursday, the German government finally announced that these 6 will not be considered liable partners anymore. So it's a big win.
Yeah, it's a big win, obviously. And you mentioned October 7th, obviously, and I wanted to ask you if you felt, because I mean, we heard a lot about UNRWA, right? This is not, it's all over the news, and we saw so many countries that have stopped their funding to UNRWA, but it took many years. I don't have the numbers, but it took many years. I mean, a lot of people were saying that UNRWA was corrupted, and it took many years for everyone to realize that. So, do you feel that the work that you do at NGO Monitors took a different dimension, or is seen differently, or now we're giving you more credit after October 7th because we've unveiled all?
Not only did it take, not only did it get a whole blown new perspective, I think what we have been doing for years became everyone's reality overnight.
Exactly.
Meaning, we all felt completely abandoned and by the international community, but more specifically by the human rights community. And this goes both for Israelis, Jewish and not, right, the victims, and the rest of us. When we heard media and leaders around the world dispute or relativize the massacre and the magnitude of what it meant to us, right? Because internally we refer to it as the worst massacre of Jews since Holocaust, which is a very strong statement by all of us to make, right? And when I say all of us, I mean members of the Jewish community, left, right, center, regardless of our personal political affiliation, but more so, not only Israelis. This goes to the Jewish communities around the world who experienced an incredible, unprecedented wave of anti-Semitic attacks and physical violence against Jews. And most of the human rights organizations, women organizations, and so on, completely failed to speak up, defend, let alone advocate for us. And so, in a way, something that before October the 7th was, inside baseball language, became completely mainstream because we all feel it. And in many ways, it is that much easier for me to explain today what it is that we do than before October the 7th. And I might as well say to that note that if, until October the 7th, every once in a while, in any industry, we would ask ourselves, is there really that much anti-Semitism, or are we sort of also perpetuating the problem because we keep talking about it and, advocating against it? And then when October the 7th happened and all the anti-Semitism showed its ugliest face, I felt reinsured and reassured in what I chose as a profession, because I really felt that, the first 48 hours we were all disappointed also at our defense, the army, right, the IDF. I mean, because we were all taken by surprise and shock. But within the first couple of days, we regained the trust because the army was out there, and so I'm not fearful that Israel is gonna physically not exist. But I do think that the battle for our legitimacy around the world and the battle for the fact that we deserve a homeland is far away from over. And that gives me a tremendous source of meaning, right, in what I do. And October 7th also gave all of us in this community, or in the industry, gave us a lot of I guess energy, because all of us have been working around the clock in trying to, everyone in his or her own
Yes.
niche.
Yes.
But yeah, so in that sense, October the 7th didn't change content-wise what we focus on, but it changed everything in how these things are viewed.
I did. And I mean, we're talking about human rights, and we're talking about October 7th, and I don't think we can not talk about the absence of reaction to what happened to the women who were raped and sexually assaulted, and the absence of reaction from the UN women's organizations. And I mean, I've seen and signed so many petitions, and we've seen this, and there's no end to how many people have denounced this. And I am always and still so surprised at the caricature, really, of how can you be an organization that is defending women's rights and against rape and be silent with what happened. I mean, I'm sure you don't have all the answers, but I'm just curious to know what is your take on that? How do we explain? Is it like plain anti-Semitism? Is it like they're denying what happened? Like, it's so obvious and so black and white. Like, I don't see any gray area here. So I can't help but wondering, like, from your experience of the field, how do you explain that? How what is your take on that?
Well, it's a very complex question. On one hand, as you say, it's a black and white thing, and there's no discussion about what's right and what's wrong here, and it's horrible. It's horrible to deny October the 7th, but to deny the physical, the sexual violence against women and men, but particularly on women, when it was so horrific, right? I mean, it gives me goosebumps even now when I speak about it. But the answer to why is very complex. Some of it, yes, of course, has to do with anti-Semitism, and there's no denying it. Whether every particular individual Jew around the world has or does not have a connection or relationship to Israel is irrelevant, because the anti-Semites make a direct link. So whatever happens here is not necessarily viewed through objective lenses that they would apply to anything else. It is viewed through the lenses of, oh, that happened in Israel, in the Jewish country, so we have to look at it differently. But it's not that simple. I would never say, and I do not think that everyone around there is anti-Semitic. I think there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of propaganda and a lot of abuse by certain politicized groups that have a very specific agenda, which is to delegitimize Israel's right to exist, right? Who have been systematically over the years abusing the human rights discourse, and the groups, that sort of operate in this community. They have successfully sort of made a direct link between the Palestinian cause and defending human rights.
The victim.
Exactly. And fighting, but it's more than the victim. It's fighting for the justice, right?
Yes.
And most of the people, they're clueless. They wouldn't necessarily be able to find Israel on a map, let alone would they know who rules what here, where the borders are, what the history is, even the most recent one, let alone the ancient one. The problem with this is that, they send around the most blatant piece of propaganda. It goes around the world because it's very emotional. And by the time we checked and vetted and, consulted our legal advisors, our response almost doesn't matter anymore, because the only thing that matters is that the emotion that they caused by it. And there's no way back to take that emotion back. A lot of this has to do with, you have heard this term so many times, with the intersectionality, right? Which is sort of connecting things that basically have nothing to do with one with another. Just because one group is oppressed and the other one claims to be oppressed doesn't necessarily mean that they're fighting for the same cause. But we then do have situation in which, Black Lives Matter will automatically support Palestinian causes without maybe checking what they're supporting or what they're marching for, or women organizations will not advocate for Israeli women, which is completely ridiculous. But they were educated over the years to sort of look at Israel as a pariah and as the oppressor, regardless of the context and regardless of the facts. And I think that is something that is one of the major challenges of our time, to stay true to our values, which is the values of democracy, and that is resorting to truth, facts, law, the rule of democracy, integrity in anything that we do, while at the same time we are trying to counter attacks that are based oftentimes on half-truths, distortions, and sometimes complete propaganda and lies. And almost everything that has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is somewhere in there. So this is not to say that the Palestinians don't deserve the right to advocate for their cause, but they do not deserve the right to spread lies and propaganda and distort truth. And oftentimes that's what happens, and the broader public is clueless, right?
Yes,
That's what the problem is.
exactly. And I think that it's so interesting to see that you're talking about the victim and the weak. And in the case of women, assault and rape, you have two causes of victims that are almost competing with each other, right? And so, but it's interesting to see that they're still choosing the Palestinian, cause over the women's cause. And I think that what you said about the emotional impact is what wins first, even if they don't have the facts. And so, talking about women. I always that's one topic that we always talk about also in this podcast, which is the advancement of women in their career, whether in any industry or in the, I don't like to call it rights, because we each have the rights that it's not about equal rights here, even though we still have to do work on that, but we can help, and I think that's really a known fact. That most people working in Jewish nonprofits, and I'm not going to say all nonprofits, but at least the Jewish nonprofits, are women. But most of the CEOs of at least the largest Jewish nonprofits are men. And of course, I'm sure there is a lot of work to do, but you are inside that world, and you are facing, I mean, you have a very high level position as a woman, but I wanted to ask you, like, how do you feel, first of all, are we going in the right direction? Are there more and more women that are reaching, high level position in the nonprofit world? And also maybe understanding why is that women don't reach? Is it because women lack self-confidence, or is it because men are not opening the doors enough to women? Like, do we have something that we have to do in terms of being more assertive or having more confidence, or is it really something that the industry needs to really open more opportunities for women in the nonprofit sector? I would love to hear your take on that.
It's not an easy topic. I think I think it's all of the above. I mean, I really think everything that you said, each of the things that you raised touches on a certain aspect of the challenge. To a certain extent, there's a generational issue here. I think the bigger the Jewish non-for-profit is, or the older and the bigger it is, the higher the percentages of the male leadership, because they tend to be more traditional, and infrastructure in the organization is probably more rigid, and it also takes a longer time to get to the senior position. So if you say, let's say that someone started 20 years ago, 20 years ago there were less women than there are today. So I do think that, and we see that in the biggest Jewish organizations, whether they are in North America or in Israel, with the really big one, it's almost exclusively men, which is very bad. It's not easy to navigate as a woman through those waters. I think, again, in terms of the generational gap, I think traditionally it was not easy for women to navigate very demanding working hours in the non-for-profit industry. Things that are okay to ask in the private sector, because the private sector is more regulated and more aware. There's also more competition, right? There's millions of companies out there, so they have to compete in offering better conditions, not only monetary, right, but working hours, I don't know, nurseries, whatever. They were the first, the business sector was way before the non-for-profit sector in terms of the gender equality and so on. In the Jewish non-for-profit sector, there's much less competition. So there's also less where to go to, and also less pressure from within to improve gender balance. But also traditionally, the non-for-profit sector, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's a lifestyle. It's not really a work. It's not really, there are no work hours, especially the more senior you become, the more true is that statement, because there are dinners and conferences and receptions and heavy travel and fundraisers and nowadays Zooms around the clock. We all work not only internationally but transatlantic. So for a woman, a wife, and a mother, sometimes that's not necessarily an easy career choice to make. So I think there's an objective challenge there, and I still believe that many women don't make that choice. Because once they become mothers, they want to be with their children, because there's a heavy price to pay to that, and only my kids know that. I mean, I tried, God knows I tried to somehow incorporate. I took my kids to conferences. My younger son was a month and a half old when I took him to the Knesset to accompany me to speak at a committee, because part of what I try to do, not as a that's not my first agenda point, but when I feel challenged as a woman, I do like to make a statement out of that. I like to show through my actions that I'm unstoppable, and just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that I have to give up on one or the other. But also, I had a baby. I'm on a maternity leave. I didn't have a lobotomy. I can still think. So you can still, invite me to a professional panel. And you know what? Having a baby, and this was, in the days of Zoom and post-COVID, so what if I'm with a baby on a Zoom? Right. If anyone has a problem with that, then that's their problem, not mine. And if they can challenge me content-wise, then that's one thing. But if they're only challenging me on whether I'm holding a baby at 6 p.m., right, Israel time, while trying to be part of a professional conversation, then it's their problem, not mine. But I try to make a statement out of that. And I've tried it out, honestly, with donors, with partner organizations. I'm yet to hear, no one has ever said anything. So sometimes we also don't necessarily trust ourselves, right? Because once we make that step, we actually realize that no one makes an issue out of that. And that's true in a lot of cases. But we are, as women, we are afraid to make that statement. We're afraid to say, well, I'm just good enough. And that will do, whether I'm here with a kid or not, or whatever it is, right? I do think that things are getting better for the younger generation, but we still definitely have a very, very long way to come. And part of it is challenging the system. Israel hasn't set a very good track record with the current government. Sorry. We have a record low women participation in the Knesset, but not only in the Knesset, but also across the board in the ministries, in executive positions. But I also think that part of the battle is on us. I do think that men feel more comfortable in asking for things and claiming their space. And we're not, we have to, I'm generalizing, obviously, but we need to do a better job at just saying, I'm this good. And saying, this is what I want, and this is how I want it. Because in my experience, when I said, almost every time when I said that, I got what I wanted. It's just maybe that the difference between men and women, that in our case, the men around us would not think of it on their own. So we have to remind them of what we want and state it clearly. Right. I mean, I could go into, but I think I'll leave it at that because the time limitation here doesn't allow
Yes.
us to.
Yes, but what I like about what you're saying, I mean, we can always sit there and complain and say it's not the way we want it and it should be different. But here, I think there's this sense of control on what we can do before, judging the evolution or the generation gap, or and say, we have to dare more, we have to ask for more. Definitely, the awareness is more present now than it was a few years ago.
For sure.
And so it's definitely on the women, on us, the women, to really make a point, and like you said, to dare to be more assertive about our needs as women. And yes, like you mentioned, I would love to continue this conversation on and on. I will end this interview by asking you, if a woman is listening to us, maybe a man even, but if someone is listening to us and wants to go into nonprofit and wants to make a difference, what is the first advice that you can give them in terms of, let's be more specific for women, because we just mentioned how, it could be more difficult. But what would be the one piece of advice that you would say if someone is contemplating saying whether I want to work or start a new nonprofit? What would be the first piece of advice that you would give? And then we'll end this episode.
I generally and genuinely believe, this is my raison d'etre. This is, that we are the best when we do what we love the most. So, and it's a general rule, whatever industry you choose to build your profession in, to excel at what you do, be the best that you can. And the same goes for the non-for-profit. And yes, you might earn less, than the private sector, but today, especially, there are many other aspects to our professional lives that we are interested in, rather than just the monetary aspect. And I have so many friends who earn incredible salaries, but they hate their jobs. And they wake up in the morning and they dread going to the office. And I can say, and I mean this, I'm fortunate. I wake up every morning full of energy and full of meaning, and I don't go to work dreading ever. I never have those days. And that's a privilege in today's world when we all work around the clock, right? Because we are all the time accessible and so on. And just like in any industry, make sure that you are the best at what you do. Make yourself indispensable, and don't wait to be told what to do. Rather, create opportunities and create that environment in which you become indispensable. Once that happens, the advancement is almost a pre-given. Now, whether it's going to come in a form of a better title or, it doesn't matter what the trajectory is, but you are going to advance because you make yourself indispensable. We too often think in terms of, that our superiors have to give us instructions and to-dos and sort of map out for us what we need to do. The right way to go about any job, and most certainly the non-for-profit sector, because the non-for-profit sector, you need to be a little bit of everything, right? In order to succeed, you need to be a content-driven person, you need to be detail-oriented, but you need to be able to zoom out, you need to understand social media, marketing, fundraising, you need to have the basic understanding of the finances and reports, and there's that versatility that is absolutely important, and you need to make yourself indispensable and create that space. If you do that, and while doing that you enjoy, then you know that you're at the right place, and you should stay there and continue doing that. The more you do that and the more you succeed, the more guaranteed the success is. So, I mean, that's the best advice I can think of, because that's how I do it.
And we can see the results. So you're a living example of what you're saying, and I think that's the best way that we can end this episode. Olga, thank you so much for your time and for your wise advice and sharing all you do in this very important work. As we mentioned, this is a very important episode as far as I'm concerned for our podcast. So thank you so much. And I will see and or hear you, everyone else, for our next episode of the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you so much, Natalie.